ball. It seemed like they came out of the break and wanted to try to make that a priority.
Three is a Blazer, nothing but net. So Robert Covington joining the three-point show, and Gary Trent Jr. with the steal up and under.
The gate, right from the jump, there's this welcoming process. Good skip to Gary Trent Jr.
Right spot, the right time will click for teams that want to be a top 10 defense. Gary Trent Jr. chopped at by Guy, finds Cantor. Cantor once again rolls it in. Folks talk about a player has energy, but that is so critical for maintaining momentum, as Gary Trent Jr. production department had a bite of that or not, but Gary Trent Jr. going to take a bite of that. Comes the rock down the floor. Nice little move on Guy. Gets it up and over Kaminsky.
Against Shaq. There were guys like Reggie Evans in Seattle. Good pass.
Back to Gary Trent Jr. He'll try a three.
Oh,
gets knocked down, but
you might need this in the broadcast. I had to look through my hands when I was sending it.
Portland still trying to find their rhythm offensively. Gary Trent Jr. challenges Bull.
8 points. Doesn't feel like it was more than 6 or so minutes.
Blazers just trying to chip away. Gary Trent Jr. 14-point advantage for Denver. Gary Trent Jr. races it down against his former team. Gary Trent Jr. Bang, bang. Dame gets to the paint. Gary Trent Jr. in the corner. Count it. Challenging Gobert. Bounce pass to Gary Trent Jr. with the finger roll.
They already know how they want to play on both ends of the floor. The Blazers are the ones.
Gary in transition. Pull up three. Oh, cash money.
On the floor.
Gary Trent Jr. fires in another one. 6 to shoot. Gary Trent Jr. open again. Make this man top billing in Los Angeles. Gary Trent Jr. Oh, the hezzy with the right off the glass, Lamar.
We had this conversation last year.
Chance to tie or take the lead. Gary Trent Jr. three from the corner. Dial it up. CJ surveying in the paint. Gary Trent Jr. rhythm bounce. Oh, yeah. Matthews able to recover. 5 seconds to go for Gary Trent Jr. Gets to the foul line.
He's
Gary
back
Trent Jr. Just all night long. Gary Trent Jr. from the corner. Bang, bang.
You see Gary guard someone who's complaining after shot. Oh, he's on one right now. An open three.
Bazemore hits the corner three. Gary Trent Jr. Play continues. Gary Trent Jr. goes to his left. Step back jumper. Pure. Simons finds Gary Trent Jr. Bang, bang. Kicks it ahead. Gary Trent Jr. in the corner. Rolls it in.
Nice pass from Carmelo.
Got to get it up. Gary Trent Jr. scoops it in. Trying to apply some pressure. Gary Trent Jr. picks it and finishes it. Gary Trent Jr. with the flush in transition. And Sampson cross-court pass. Gary Trent Jr. rattles it home. But Cantor gives him another chance. Gary Trent Jr. Double team on Dame. Gary Trent Jr. from outside. It's good. Chases his own dribble. Gary Trent Jr. trying to be an opportunistic scorer, and he is.
Rockets. Oh, that's my first connection to Portland. Oh,
tonight.
Good pass from Harry. Ball was tipped.
Gary Trent Jr. Back out to Simons. Nice look. Beautiful play by the Blazers. Gary Trent Jr. pull up. That's good.
Wood walked inside Oladipo, outside Trent three. Good. Outside as here comes Hood. Open Trent three. Late close by DeMarcus Giles. Outside Trent on the fly. Three. Good again. After they trailed by 11, and earlier the Blazers led by 20. Three. Good. Blazers ahead it goes. Lillard, Trent, Trey. Good. Shooting for the Blazers down to 42%. Finds an open. Melo inside.
Spinning and finishing.
Nice.
Early in the game. Gary, filthy.
And that's how you create long-standing culture within an organization. Is to not give up.
Dame, beautiful pass to Gary Trent Jr. Try to send two. Nice find to Gary Trent Jr. Anthony Simons stepping back in for CJ Ellaby. Gary Trent Jr. up top, bang, bang. Gary Trent Jr. clean look from Dame, and the Blazers are filling it.
With Giannis, it ends in a dunk most of the time. With Westbrook, they turn their backs, and it leads to a run-out GT3.
Gary Trent Jr. Gary Trent Jr. up ahead, pump fake, gets it by Embiid. Nice find, Gary Trent Jr.
You want to take that shot at the end. Another good job from the Blazers, double teaming, and Gary.
Blazers a chance to take their first lead. Gary Trent Jr. Blazers will slow it down. Covington wide open from Gary Trent Jr. Covington Nice connection to Gary Trent Jr. Bang, bang. Gary Trent Jr., nobody checking him as he brings it all the way down the court.
Blazers. Now Trent Jr. lets a three go, and he sticks it in the hood. Boy, Trent got a step. Guarded by Simmons. Lillard probing, finds Trent. And late in the shot clock, Trent.
Allen misses the three. Gary Trent Jr. tries to bring it down himself, able to regain control. Jr. 6 points in the first quarter. Step back three. Bang, bang. Gary Trent Jr. loses Drummond and shows it to him, Lamar.
Oh, man. Like that, he got all basketball to help force the miss.
Gary Trent Jr. Those two a huge reason for their team's success. And Gary Trent Jr. Porzingis, and more defense for the Blazers. Not much opposition on that one. OKC, Gary Trent Jr. Bang, bang. Wide open. First of a back-to-back. Gary Trent Jr. As Melo gets it to Gary Trent Jr. He tries to go high off the glass. Gary Trent Jr. pump fake, no contact. Simons trying to handle the pass. Trent Jr. before the horn. Huge three. Hayes at 6'11", 220. Trent Jr. sizing up Williamson. Pump fake. And the Blazers. The defense whips a pass to Trent Jr. Pump fake, step back three. Bang,
Welcome
bang.
home, Rocco.
Trent Jr. down the lane. Can't get the tough finish. Rips away the rebound and puts it right back in. Trent Jr. Good to see that three go in. Or more threes. Trent Jr. trying to help the cause.
41% from the three-point line. He's athletic on the break.
Blazers hurry it down the court. Trent Jr. with the steal. Open runway. Liftoff. Trent Jr. sets his feet for a three. Collins, one of the four Blazers, unable to go tonight due to injury. Here with 3 minutes and some change left in the first half. Trent Jr. shaking Looney. Covington gets on the floor. Trent Jr. trying to race ahead. Bazemore away by Trent Jr. Chasing down the orange and gets the slam.
GT.
Get a few more ticks on the clock. Trent Jr. Simons in the open court. Trent Jr. spot up. Got it.
Necessary.
Trent Jr. Beautiful find from Lillard.
And Cotton was able to elevate like that.
Trent Jr. Trent Jr. the steal. Edwards in pursuit.
And one.
And Gary pop it free. Trent Jr. a three in transition. Got it. Trent Jr. corner three, and that is a clean look. His second personal. Trent Jr. shaking Edwards and sticking the jumper. It's a rebound. Trent Jr. will tee it up and drops it in.
There goes that rebound.
Trent Jr. trying to go by Ingram. Duke on Duke crime. Slips it to Trent Jr. Attacks Alexander Walker. Gets fouled.
CJ knew that was his opportunity to prove it on the big stage. Great job.
Trent Jr. with the thievery. Trying to go coast to coast. Closely by Bledsoe. Tries to turn the corner. Back outside. Jones Jr. 4-3. Kicks out to Trent Jr. Bang, bang.
Right back at it.